What I'll do with this talk, we'll obviously stick to the format with two parts. It starts off quite light, and then it gets very heavy. It's quite mechanistic, but I think that's essentially important in this particular domain, looking at a category of compounds that affect the mind and consciousness, and of course the brain so profoundly that we can ground these phenomena in nature, in science. That's what science is. It's a commitment to nature. Here we're looking at a category of experiences that can be described as somehow conjuring up notions of the supernatural. The experience is so unusual. Yet, as someone who has a commitment to science and a commitment to nature, I very much have, I think, a pure and honest agenda in trying to understand all of the phenomena that you'll see in the context of psychedelics in terms of the natural world. And we can do that through a number of different ways. So let's start with the very basics. What are psychedelics? Why don't we start with the etymology of the term psychedelic? It means mind revealing. You could also say it means soul, psyche, perhaps more accurately translating as soul. And then the other part is to reveal, to manifest, or to make visible. According to those who chose this neologism, this made-up word to try and capture the essence of what these compounds do principally, they fell upon this notion that made sense to them. Humphrey Osmond, who came up with the term, Aldous Huxley, who was his kind of muse in a way. They were sort of competing for the best term. But it's the term that stuck. Most people in the general public think of psychedelic, the term psychedelic perhaps as having some relationship to art or psychedelic music. And perhaps they're not always aware that it actually has this etymology very firmly in psychology. Psychiatrist and an author in Aldous Huxley trying to find the most apt term, and then it was psychedelic, mind-revealing, that stuck. And I'm glad it did, because it's a much better term in my view, and it's an accurate term. I think more precise than some of the other alternatives like hallucinogen, which only really refers to one component of the experience, that these compounds can alter perception in a particular way. There are others as well, psychotomimetic, that these compounds can, in their effects, mimic certain aspects of psychosis. Again, that's complex. We could go there. Perhaps we will at some point. And then you have others like entheogen, the idea that these compounds will manifest an experience of the divine, an experience of God, God's presence. But that also is a bit complicated. But we'll certainly touch on that theme as we go on. So psychedelic, here are some examples. We have psilocybin, which is found in so-called magic mushrooms, a term coined in the late 1950s. Psilocybin is actually a prodrug of psilocin. Prodrug meaning it's a precursor. It gets into the body, it gets metabolized, and then psilocin is the compound that works on the brain in a particular way to produce this drug's characteristic subjective effect. Dimethyltryptamine, a very similar molecule to psilocin, that can be taken, it can be smoked, it can be injected. It can't be taken orally because it gets broken down in the gut. Certain enzymes will break it down and stop it getting into the brain. So that's where ayahuasca comes along, which is a tea, a brew that has been taken for many generations, some think millennia in certain aspects of the world, particularly in Southern America. And it's a combination of DMT usually in leaves, and that combined with certain vines, and actually ayahuasca is referring to the vine. I think it means vine of the dead, and the combination of these two ingredients, the vine containing inhibitors of those enzymes that will break down the DMT in the gut, monoamine oxidase inhibitors are found in the vine. That's combined with the DMT containing leaves, and then people have a psychedelic experience with ayahuasca. LSD, perhaps the prototypical psychedelic, discovered first in 1938 by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, who then kind of put it aside. He wasn't aware of its psychoactive effects. In 1943, he thought he'd have another look at it. He did a self-experiment where he took what he thought was a very low dose of LSD, 250 micrograms, some knowing laughs in the audience because it's actually a very large dose. It's probably about 3 acid tabs. And so he thought he was dying. He got on his bike, he cycled home as quickly as he could. His colleague, I think, came with him, and he thought the journey was taking forever, but apparently they did it at a sort of record speed. He got home and his neighbour came round and he thought she was a malevolent witch and had really quite a dysphoric experience. However, he also said that the next day he felt rejuvenated. He said he felt reborn. He said his breakfast tasted particularly good. He went out in the garden and it was as if he was seeing the world afresh. So that interesting paradox that people can have very intense, often unpleasant experiences while on the drug itself can contrast quite starkly with how people feel after the experience. Now, if you look at the molecular structure of these compounds, what you'll see is how similar they are to a naturally occurring brain chemical, serotonin, a major neuromodulator, neurotransmitter. It modulates the way the brain works. It's a particularly complex neuromodulator. Neurotransmitters work by being released and then stimulating what we call receptors. So these are proteins that sit on brain cells, and when they're activated, they'll initiate a particular response in the host cell. And so serotonin has some 14, at least 14, we think, different receptors that all tune the behavior of brain cells, functional brain cells, neurons, in a particular way. And there's one particular one that seems to be very important for the action of these compounds, psychedelics. So what is that receptor? It's called the serotonin 2A receptor. It's an excitatory receptor. When it's activated by serotonin or a drug that's kind of mimicking serotonin, sort of substituting for serotonin. So when it's activated, it'll excite the host cell, and then if that's an excitatory cell, like a glutamatergic cell, it's getting a bit harder now, then you're going to excite the brain, and actually that's what psychedelics do to a large extent. They create a kind of excitation in the brain, particularly where, of course, these receptors are most highly expressed. So where are they most highly expressed in the brain? There isn't a homogeneous distribution all over the brain. And so that's what we are seeing here in this heat map. This is actually a positron emission tomography scan, PET scan. What's happened is we've radio labeled a highly selective psychedelic drug, something called an N-bomb, otherwise known as SYMB36. We put a radioactive tag on it. It's injected into the body. It gets into the brain and it sticks where it is sticky for, which is the serotonin 2A receptors. And then because it's radioactively labeled, we can pick up where the radiation is strongest and we can see where those receptors are. And so it is a heat map, so the hotter colors, the red colors are where the expression is highest, the blue colors are where the expression is lowest. And you've probably heard of the cortex. We're those animals with so much of it. Really, that's what sets us apart from other animals, is the massive expansion and convolution of our cortex, particularly to our body size. That's really what makes us unique anatomically, at least in terms of the brain. And so you can see these 2A receptors are very much cortical receptors, massive expression all over the cortex, higher in certain regions, but very low in the subcortical regions that do more rudimentary functions. Also, curiously, in the hippocampus as well, quite low expression. So what of the cortex? Of course, the cortex isn't a uniform thing itself. It has different modules and systems that subserve different functions. The back of the brain is for vision. You have these association cortices that are for more complex functions like thinking and high-level thinking, abstract thinking. And lo and behold, that's where those receptors, these serotonin 2A receptors, are most highly expressed in the highest level aspect of the human brain. So hierarchically, they're way up there. They're right at the top. And that's something important, and that kind of hints at what they may be doing to brain function. So I've said that the 2A receptor is important, but how do we know that? We know that because the affinity of a psychedelic drug for this particular receptor correlates very strongly with its potency. So affinity means stickiness. How strongly does it bind to a particular receptor? In the case of LSD, for example, it has a very high affinity for the 2A receptor, and it's incredibly potent. So that's why people can feel the effects with just 20 micrograms, a tiny speck of this particular drug, and then higher doses, such profound effects on consciousness. We also know that if we block this 2A receptor with what we call an antagonist, that's just a blocker, and then we give a psychedelic, people won't trip. They won't really have a psychedelic experience. It seems to abolish all the characteristic subjective effects, behavioral effects, and brain effects of psychedelics. So this is really solid evidence now that this 2A receptor is especially important for the action of these drugs. Something else we did recently was to use computational modeling, putting in a lot of different biological properties like the tracts in the brain and the basic anatomy, and then modeling different cell types, and then throwing in the regional distribution of the 2A receptors. That's this one here. You can see it here as well. And then using this information, we could essentially predict what LSD does to the brain when we look at functional brain changes in activity. That sounds particularly difficult to get your head around. Basically, it's just telling us that this distribution of the 2A receptor can predict what you see in the brain when you look at brain activity when you give a psychedelic. So it's further confirmation of the importance of this 2A receptor. Now, this slide is speaking to one basic principle. It looks quite frightening, and there's all those references there, but really that's just to emphasize to you that the evidence for an association between these classical psychedelic drugs that work on the serotonin system in this particular way, there's a very strong association between the effects of these drugs and something we call plasticity. What's plasticity? Well, it can be defined in quite a broad sense as the ability to change. So it could be neuroplasticity, it could be changes in the brain, it could be anatomical changes, it could be functional changes, but also changes in behavior. If we use plasticity in this broad sense, the evidence that psychedelics promote it is really very compelling. So let's just run through some of those evidences. There's very strong association already, very strong evidence already for an association between serotonin itself, broadly, not just the 2A receptor, but serotonin itself, and sensitivity to the environment. And the direction of that seems to be that higher serotonin levels in the synapse, let's just say higher serotonin levels, more sensitivity to the environment. Growing evidence for that. Also, a key role for serotonin in brain development. Of course, early on in our lives, we're especially plastic. We're changing all the time, and we're exceptionally sensitive to the environment, of course. We also know something a bit more specific. We know that if we stimulate the 2A receptor, that's what agonism is. It's different. It's the opposite to antagonism. Antagonism is blocking. Agonism is stimulating. If we stimulate this key receptor, we can promote certain aspects of learning, low-level learning, not advanced learning. but things like associative learning, cognitive flexibility, the ability to change behaviors that perhaps get entrenched, and a lot of animal literature supporting that association. We also know that the growth of new components of the synapse, where all the communication, the important communication is going on between neurons, between functional brain cells. We know that that can be promoted, the growth of these functional components, by psychedelics, and particularly compelling evidence for that being published just this year in a top journal called Cell. We also know that those 2A receptors are highest during key developmental periods, so early in life. This is another PET image labeling serotonin 2A receptors. You can see a young brain on the left and an older brain, 68-year-old, on the right, and much less expression there. So in a way, a kind of schematic just showing that principle that the 2A receptors, important for plasticity and change, are there in abundance early in life. We also know that a particular process that occurs in the brain as we develop, which could be summarized as specialization, is kind of reversed in a sense under psychedelics. So rather than a differentiation, a specialization in the brain as the brain matures and we mature and we become more, I guess, analytical and maybe sophisticated in our thinking and behavior, what you see under a psychedelic is a kind of regression, a backtracking of that development. But that might create these conditions of plasticity where we may be able to relearn, going back to an earlier state, a plastic state, in order to perhaps unlearn things and maybe learn new things. Also, something particularly intriguing is that there's a lot of evidence that stress can promote the functioning and also the expression of this key receptor that psychedelics work on. And I think that's interesting because it may hint at why those receptors are there. If you ask some people, some entertaining and speculative writers, they might say that these 2A receptors are there for an endogenous psychedelic, perhaps, or they might say something even more speculative than that, that perhaps they've evolved because of use of psychedelics, but maybe there's something a little bit more plausible about why those receptors are there, and I would suggest that when do you need to be especially labile, changeable, flexible, adaptable? Well, perhaps under conditions of extreme stress, it would make sense to have that adaptability. So that would be my suggestion, that psychedelics are kind of hijacking a system that's there in the brain for fundamental change if and when we need that. So this is just a schematic from that paper I was telling you in Cell, where you can see here with the psychedelics the increase of these functional components of the synapse with the psychedelic. Okay, so now just to provide a little bit of kind of cultural context, running through the history of developments in psychiatry, where we have the so-called pharmacological revolution really taking off in the 1950s, the discovery of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Remember, they're a component of ayahuasca. But these were the first antidepressants, and so starting to kind of change the way, and similar period, the first antipsychotics come along. And this is starting to change the way that clinicians are managing mental illness. And then in terms of developments in pharmacology, we have the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors coming in the 1980s. So these are the Prozac-like drugs. These are now the drugs that really, I would say, almost dominate psychiatry, certainly dominates the management of depression. And rather than promoting what we call monoamines, which include serotonin, but also dopamine and noradrenaline in the brain, here we have a category of drugs that are just promoting one of those, serotonin. So it was around about this time, and really with the discovery of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that a theory that serotonin is arguably the important neuromodulator in the brain in terms of understanding the neurochemistry, if you want, of depression, started to really gain traction. It was really with the discovery of those drugs that began to be stamped in, that idea. Over time, perhaps it's become a bit sort of perverted, really, as an idea, and too much is read into that. But that's another story, perhaps. Psychedelics, and this isn't necessarily to say, to forget that these, in their plant form, are in certain cultures sacred medicines that have been used for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But now we're looking at them again. They were looked at in a brief window of time between around about 1950 and the late 1960s in psychiatry. Number of reasons why that fell away, a lot of them political. But now we're rediscovering these compounds, and we are becoming more and more aware of their pharmacology. And what we're seeing is that it's becoming more precise. If these do have promise in therapy, then here we have a class of drugs that are more specific in their pharmacological action. That's just one aspect of what psychedelic therapy is, of course, the pharmacology, but it is also, a very fundamental aspect of it. What's the other side? Well, let's think about the dominance of psychodynamic psychology and psychoanalysis in the early 20th century, and how the pharmacological revolution kind of took over from 1960s, I suppose, things starting to change. But now we have something which in a way is a combination of both. It is a drug-assisted psychotherapy. You can't characterize this treatment model as just a drug action. If you go down that route, you're really making a big mistake. And equally, of course, there's a drug component here. It's not just a psychological aspect. So it makes sense both to understand psychedelics in this way as a composite treatment model. That's how we should understand this, and I would argue research it. But that may well also be the best way to utilize this treatment model, would be to really exploit that synergy between a category of drugs that promote adaptability and plasticity and flexibility, and then certain skilled manipulation of context and psychological care. And also, researching psychedelics can help us understand the serotonin system, I would suggest. So that classic enigma that has perplexed scientists for so long, what does serotonin do? At least, what does serotonin do in the brain? What does it do to the mind? A dominant model that's still highly influential, and it's not that this has in any way sort of died off as a theory. It's just that we've got others to complement it now. But it's that serotonin works to mitigate stress, to moderate stress, and to moderate the extremes of emotion. And that might be why it can be helpful in depression and possibly other disorders. A kind of complementary principle is that serotonin promotes patience. So it's a kind of anti-impulsivity neuromodulator, and good evidence for that now. But I alluded to this earlier, and I think it's an important nuance on the serotonin system. What does it do in the brain? There's increasing evidence that if you increase serotonin levels in the synapse, broadly speaking, you will increase sensitivity to context, the likes of Igor Branky driving that work. And if you have, if you do manipulations that will lower serotonin functioning, then people will be less sensitive to the environmental context. So some evidence, for example, that if you up the dose of an SSRI promoting serotonin function, then if people have favorable environmental conditions, they will do well, but if conditions are adverse, they could actually do badly with that upping of the dose, and also complementary evidence in animals as well. So the key additional principle here is to say that what we have with psychedelics, if this rule that these are compounds that very much promote sensitivity to context, what it's perhaps saying to us is that this nuance of the serotonin story, that it's involved in sensitivity to the environment, sensitivity to context, may be being mediated by this particular serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. I put above that the paradox of therapeutic psychotomimetics, because it's just speaking to that principle that you can have a compound that can produce unpleasant effects, sometimes acutely, perhaps mimicking certain aspects of psychosis. And yet it can also be therapeutic. And another example of this is a drug that some people are describing, and have been for a few years, as one of the major breakthroughs in psychopharmacology, and that's ketamine, now being used in depression on a huge scale in America, and being increasingly used also in the UK. There's a ketamine clinic in Oxford, for example. And it's perhaps a principle there that's not emphasized as much as it is with the classic psychedelics, but that role of environment and context and perhaps therapeutic care that can work together particularly well with a drug that promotes plasticity. But ketamine is another compound that people say can mimic certain aspects of psychosis when given, yet it seems to have these therapeutic effects post-acutely after the drug effects have worn off. Okay, so this is a slide that very much summarizes the latest evidence base for psychedelic therapy. In a way, this could be a talk in itself, and so I've tried to just reduce it down here. The first thing to address is, of course, the safety profile. Psychedelics are drugs that have seemed to scare people historically, to some extent with good reason. Good reason because they are very potent. They do alter consciousness in a particularly profound way. It wouldn't be particularly safe for someone to be on a psychedelic and in a urban environment, in around traffic, for example, or and so those kind of behavioral risk factors are important to consider. That's why when we give psychedelics therapeutically, we do it in a controlled environment. We have people sitting with the individual, and we make sure that they don't. There's no real possibility of any self-injurious behaviors. We also know that these compounds have a very low, if not negligible, addiction profile. So animals won't self-administer these drugs. That's very different, of course, in a lot of other drugs of potential misuse, and including legal drugs such as alcohol and nicotine. So most drugs of so-called recreation that people might take for fun tend to be self-administered by animals, and they can be, moreish and be associated with addictive behaviors in humans. That's not the case with psychedelics. So you don't typically see, LSD addicts or magic mushroom addicts. It's just not something, the concept's almost laughable. And also, do people really take these drugs for recreation? Are they drugs of fun? If you take, some LSD and your neighbor becomes a malevolent witch who's trying to poison you, that doesn't sound like that much fun. So for those, at least, who are educated enough and understand really what these drugs do, which of course should be everyone, including, of course, children, then they'll know that they need to be taken in a particular way. And when they take them in that way, they're really taking them more for self-exploration or perhaps for some kind of therapeutic end. That's not to say, of course, that people can take these drugs in a reckless way as well, but at least it's important to stress that message that when we look at these compounds, both in terms of research and particularly when we give them therapeutically, we very much manipulate the context and try and provide as much as possible a perfectly nurturing, supportive environment in the same way that you would for a child, for example. You know, in a very supple plastic state, we're going to try and provide perfect conditions for their development. It's the same kind of principle with someone who's vulnerable under the influence of a psychedelic. The side effects that we've seen in the modern clinical research include anxiety. A lot of this has to do with before the experience. You know, we try and be very transparent with patients and brief them properly. And so we will say things like, you could be very scared, you know, under these compounds. It can be very, very unusual. You know, perhaps one of the most unusual experiences of your life. You might be terrified. You might think you're going to die. You might think you're going mad. You might think you'll never come down. But we're with you. We support you throughout. We know that this doesn't happen. There haven't been any cases in the modern clinical research of enduring psychotic responses, for example, with psychedelics. You know, people think they're dying, but the toxicity profile, especially with psilocybin, is incredibly good. You know, much better than a lot of psychiatric medications, much better than ketamine. And so people, you know, through the drug effects itself, they don't die. These aren't drugs with any kind of morbidity risk, except for behavioral risk. If people take them in the wrong kind of context and then there's some kind of injury, for example. And psychosis as well, looking at meta-analyses and the modern trials, the prevalence of any enduring psychoses are so low. The cases in the extensive work that was done in the 50s and 60s were very isolated and often associated with poor screening. So, for example, people, one individual who got through, who had a brother with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, had an enduring psychotic response. But that's in the context of, I think, several thousand patients that were looked at, so very low risk. I'd refer you to a very good review paper by James Rucker, now at the IOP, has an NIHR grant to do depression research with psilocybin at the moment. A very thorough review that looks at all of these meta-analyses and kind of pulls it together. HPPD is worth mentioning. That's called hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder. It's it's based on reports that you see occasionally from people who've taken a psychedelic and say they still experience some residual perceptual changes. The prevalence of that being distressing is actually very low, but for some people they do have that. So that's something that deserves further research. In the modern trials, we haven't seen any cases. Colleagues, I haven't heard of any cases. In terms of recreational use, you do sometimes hear of cases, but they often seem quite complex. And so, but you know, if people are reporting this and saying, at least on some occasions, that it's distressing for them, I think they deserve that it be researched. So we've got questionnaires now looking at this in our studies. We do online surveys looking at this. We did one in the past which suggested the the prevalence is very low, but there are sample biases and such like. So we'll look at this in the controlled research, and I know that other researchers are as well. So if we start looking more at the question of efficacy, things were really kicked off by this study in 2006, which was after the hiatus that occurred when psychedelics were essentially banned from research. They were made illegal, but that had repercussions for legitimate scientific research, and a number of different factors meant that people essentially just couldn't research these compounds. It's hard to justify, I would say ethically, to justify a situation like that. But in time, you know, as people start to revisit the literature and see that this can be done, people start doing clinical research again in patient populations with psychedelics. And this study in 2006 is really quite a modest study, and the outcomes are quite modest too. But it was looking at obsessive compulsive disorder and psilocybin magic mushrooms. Some indication of efficacy and safety, but Francesco Moreno, who was running that study, was under a lot of sort of regulatory pressure, and that research was cut short, and also minimal funding. So I think they only treated 9 patients, and things fell relatively quiet. But Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins in the US did a very interesting study, double-blind study design with an active placebo, methylphenidate, Ritalin, an ADHD drug. And people either got a very high dose of psilocybin. All of the sample had never taken a psychedelic drug before. They were either given a very high dose of psilocybin or methylphenidate, quite a high dose. And really it was a psychological study. They were looking at psychological responses and also long-term responses. And what they found was quite remarkable. They found that in about 2/3 of the sample, people rated their experience as being among the most meaningful, most personally meaningful of the whole of their lives. Over 14 months on, a similar proportion were maintaining that this was still up there with the most profound experiences of the whole of their lives, up there with things like the birth of their first child. When they applied scales that have been used in the context of spontaneous spiritual or mystical experiences, they found a very high rate of prevalence of these kinds of experiences, essentially indistinguishable in many ways from those spontaneously occurring spiritual or mystical experiences. And that those experiences also seem to be mediating those long-term changes. Changes in well-being, increases, and also changes in personality, particularly specifically in the domain of openness, enduring changes over a year on in that domain of personality. I've got suicidality in here because we looked specifically at suicidality in a recent depression trial that we did, treatment-resistant depression, and we saw no cases of any increases. There's a degree of ambiguity in relation to SSRIs and suicidality, some evidence that there may be issues there in young people, for example. But we saw significant drops in suicidality, similar to as has been seen with ketamine. We're now looking at that more extensively. And also in a population study surveying close to 200,000 Americans, and looking at drug use, a range of different drugs, whether alcohol, opiates or psychedelics, and then controlling for different factors and different demographics, and also controlling for other drug use. They found a relationship that was anomalous with psychedelics and mental health. So they actually found better mental health outcomes in those who'd recently used a psychedelic, something that they didn't find with the other drugs. In fact, the expected thing in the other direction. Drug use is usually bad for mental health, but in this case, not so it seemed with the psychedelics. Also, psychological distress was lower in those who'd used psychedelics more recently. End-of-life distress, this has made some waves in recent years through research at UCLA, first of all, Charlie Grobe, and then Roland Griffiths at Hopkins and his team, and Stephen Ross at NYU, doing very nice studies now, double-blind RCTs, bigger samples than some of the modest ones that we've done and others before us, and finding really impressive outcomes, so rapid drops in anxiety and depressive symptoms, and enduring, often with just a single administration of the drug. That's really something I should have emphasized here. People who'd never taken a psychedelic before, just one experience that might last for 4 or 5 hours, and then over 14 months on, we're seeing these high proportions of enduring increases in well-being. So this is where it starts to get quite interesting. In addiction work now, people showing remarkable outcomes in smoking addiction, 80% abstinence rates after 2 treatment sessions with psilocybin, for smoking addiction. Those kind of rates are pretty much unheard of in the literature. Alcohol dependence. Michael Bogenschutz finding significant drops in drinking behaviors several months on from 1 or 2 treatment sessions with psilocybin. We've looked at depression, treatment-resistant depression. That's a chart from our little open-label study. The sample were particularly severe. Really, that's where the value of this study was. So some of the patients had tried 11 different types of medication. Virtually everyone had tried some form of psychotherapy, often multiple psychotherapies. And so quite stubborn depressions and quite severe. 20 patients, 18 of whom met criteria for severe depression at baseline, the other 2 moderate, and we see these rapid drops. So it's difficult for you to see, but at 1 week, we see these drops here. Oh gosh, do I have a, yes? No, okay. Well, at the first drop, so the black is the mean value. You can see at baseline quite severe, a drop after 1 week. Enduring drop up to 3 weeks. Half of the patients were in remission, essentially meaning they no longer have their depressions, at least at that time period. 5 weeks, half still showing response, and then some signs of relapse in a proportion of the patients at 3 months and 6 months. This is with just 2 treatment sessions, only one of which I would describe as a sort of appropriate therapeutic dose. First dose was 10 milligrams, a week later 25 milligrams. It's the kind of dose that's being used in these other studies now. It's a high dose. It's the kind of dose that can produce these very profound peak experiences, spiritual experiences. Some would call them mystical. I have a slight problem with that term. But anyway, these very profound experiences that seem to mediate the therapeutic responses. Now major investments coming in, so a couple of companies competing, at least 2, one slightly ahead in the race, getting FDA breakthrough therapy designation recently for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Several $1 million raised, the kind of money they need to do a potentially pivotal trial. They have big ambitions to bring psilocybin to licensing within a period of about 5 years. So let's wait and see. But the money's coming in. It's all set up. So let's let the science tell, I suppose, and hope it's done well as well. It's being advised, I should say, by very significant players in academic psychiatry. So they have the current, I think, head of the American Psychiatric Association, former head of the European Psychiatric Association, Tom Insel, former head of NIMH. Major bodies in academic psychiatry are on the scientific advisory board for this organization. So this isn't just some, young people who have a quirky interest in these compounds anymore. This is quite serious business. And as I said, the regulators are on side. FDA breakthrough therapy designation coming for psilocybin. Similar for MDMA, a sort of quasi-psychedelic, works more broadly on the serotonin system. Also, the European Medicines Agency have been advising on this and saying very positive things, looking at the toxicity profile, the safety profile, and the initial signs of effectiveness. So there we go. That's the crash course in the evidence base for the therapy. And so, as essentially a neuroscientist, although with a background in depth psychology as well, which is a kind of funny mix, it's natural to ask that question. I think it's such a fundamental question, especially looking at something so unusual, and challenging. And that question is, how do they work? How does this treatment work? What are the potential mechanisms? What are the potential actions? So here, I'm borrowing from arguably the dominant model of how the mind and brain works in psychology and cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, which is the predictive processing model. It's essentially a model that says that the way the mind and brain works is very much according to principles of prediction and trial and error, having a hypothesis, having an internal model, and testing it as we sample data, and then updating our models. And so that continual sort of revision and refinement of internal models is essentially the basis of this predictive processing, predictive coding model. And so how does that fit in here? Well, when I did my crash course of the modern therapeutic work, I showed that a range of different disorders that seem to be signal for all these different disorders. And that's quite a curious thing, particularly in modern psychiatry, where there's often at least pharmacological based psychiatry, biological psychiatry, where there's a desire for very clear biomarkers that describe a particular specific disorder that fits very neatly into our categorization of those disorders. And then that would be neat because we could come along with a specific, magic bullet and treat it in this very neat way with a perfect pharmacology, and hey presto, we've got the solution there. But the reality is quite far from that. There's a lot of crossover between different disorders, both in terms of their underlying biology and the fact that certain drugs can treat a range of different disorders. So it doesn't really fit the evidence. It comes more from a place of wishful thinking and perhaps also industry forces. So what do we have as a possibility? Perhaps one way we might characterize a lot of mental suffering is that what underlies it, for whatever reason, is the entrenchment of pathological internal models. And those are models that might guide our thinking, and they might guide our behavior. And they become very stuck and very rigid, and they draw us in, and they have a gravitational pull, and it's very hard to escape them. And so in such a situation, what kind of solution might we need? Well, if we could only relax those internal models, just look at your expression, just mouth agape. If we could relax those internal models, perhaps in a profound way, in a supportive environment, and then work towards some kind of revision. That might be a revision that takes some time, but initially, in order to revise the belief, it would help if we could first relax that belief. So that's where I would propose psychedelics are working. Just as we come to the break, it's probably the right kind of time, is it, for a break? Yeah. Just a little bit of a play with predictive processing. If you didn't believe that it's how the mind and brain works, that internal models very much dominate our experience of the world. We don't have direct access, if you want, to data in a very pure and direct way. Our experience is very much dominated in this top-down way by these models that we house in our minds. That's why we can read this text and we don't instead get lost by the way the letters are jumbled up. I hope you can read it. And why when you look at something like this, to how many people is that moving? Yeah, quite a few. It's static. It gets me every time. But it's because there's implied motion. So, these kind of shapes and patterns we usually see in the context of motion. Therefore, our dominant internal models kick in, and that's what we see. It's a kind of induced hallucination. So there we go. I'll draw an end to the first part here. We'll do a bit more about mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, a bit more, a bit more of a focus on the actual brain imaging results after the break. So just to kind of bring ourselves back to where we were, it's this principle of predictive coding that our experience of the world, of ourselves, is very much mediated through this kind of handshake between internal models and incoming sensory information, through models and data, if you want. And how, particularly in psychopathology and a range of different disorders, but also ordinarily, our models dominate. But what might happen in a range of different disorders is those models may become particularly entrenched, stamped in. Why they do that, we don't know. One might speculate they do it because of an intolerable uncertainty for whatever reason, whether there are biological drivers of that and or environmental drivers. It makes sense that there would be both, but that might be a precondition for why models perhaps can get stuck and can become so stubborn and influential. And so that's just an idea that others have kind of alluded to, and I think it's quite appealing that beliefs, models that guide thinking and behavior can tighten up as a defensive response to uncertainty. And perhaps this intolerance of uncertainty might account for the way we can kind of retreat, I think probably most classically in depression, but of course not just depression, kind of retreat from all sorts of things, retreat from ourselves, from our emotions, retreat from other people, retreat from a sense of meaning and purpose, and become disconnected. When a colleague of mine, a clinical psychologist, interviewed our patients from our depression trial 6 months after the treatment and asked them some very simple and open questions like, did this work for you, and if so, how, and what was it like when you were depressed, and how were your previous treatments, and how does psilocybin compare, and this kind of thing. Anyway, when she was asking them about their depression, she heard something that you'll hear in a lot of other places as well. There's a book on this by Johann Hari, The Principle of Disconnection, underlying a lot of mental suffering. But here's a patient from our depression trial saying that when in the throes of the depression at baseline, I'd look at orchids and intellectually understand that there was beauty, but not experience it. And if we had an effective treatment that could promote more of a connection between the internal models that we house and our experience of data in all its forms, whether it comes from within our bodies, our emotions, our memories, but also from the world through our interactions with others and the meaning structures that we exist in, then that would be a good thing. Here's another patient talking about how things were after the effective treatment, in this case with psilocybin. When I went outside, everything was bright and very bright and colourful, and it felt different. I noticed things I don't usually notice, the leaves on the trees and the birds' small details. So I do encourage you to look up that paper, Rosalind Watts, published last year, Psychedelics. What is it? Acceptance and connectedness. I think they're in the title, but Rosalind Watts, do look that up. Just to continue with that theme, because we speculate that it's something quite fundamental and important, but it's abstract. What can we do about that abstraction? Well, we could improve our definition. We could think more carefully about our definition, and we could operationalize that by having a measure of it and then validating that measure, testing it, looking at its different components. And so that's what we're doing. We've got a scale here. I'm just showing you 3 of about 20 items that we have. The process of validating a scale is that you can drop items and maybe come up with a new version and such like. Just going by all of the items, a very rudimentary way of doing the analyses to begin with. We've seen in the context of some survey work that we've done that it is something that is that's quite markedly increased post-treatment with psychedelics, at least to the same extent, if not more so, than other things like well-being, for example. So it does seem to be something that's very sensitive to change after a psychedelic experience. Just some of the items I'll read very quickly. I've felt connected to my senses, so that's connection to oneself, I suppose, interoception. I've been able to fully experience emotion, whether positive or negative, sort of sitting with emotion, emotional acceptance, and I've felt connected to a purpose in life, so related to meaning. Yes, that's a work in progress, but I just wanted to share that with you. Something else that we've been doing, which may tap into this construct more behaviorally, is this task where we provide patients and controls actually at baseline with a list of different possible life events that might happen over a 1-month period. half of them are good, half of them are bad. You know, I might get arrested. I might meet up with an old friend, have a dinner party, something like that. And so people estimate the likelihood of those things happening over a 1 month period. And then at the end of the month, you can ask them whether they happened or not. And it's a way of kind of reality checking whether they were overly optimistic or more likely pessimistic at baseline, and then how that might change post-treatment. So that's what we did in our patients, and we saw what you would expect at baseline, a massive pessimism bias. Curiously, there's a few that are sort of hugging a sort of midline, almost as if they're a bit too optimistic. That's curious. Most of them are down here, and there's a relationship between the severity of their depression using a standard rating scale for depression severity, the Beck Depression Inventory, and their pessimism. So more pessimism, more depressed according to the standard scale. Then post-treatment, we see a change in the depression score. We see, in some cases, massive improvements, 40 points on the BDI, and that's correlating with a shift from the pessimism to something more balanced. And that's important to emphasize. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. So this is looking at the accuracy of the prediction. And what you wouldn't want with a treatment like this is something that's going to spin people into some kind of mania or hypermania, where they're too optimistic now. They're not seeing the world particularly accurately. There's a kind of dangerous optimism, and that's what we didn't see. So at baseline, here are the patients, the massive pessimism bias. Healthy individuals, we know, naturally have a bit of an optimism bias. Maybe it's functional. 1 week post-treatment in the patients, 1 week after a similar period of time in the controls, we see something which is quite close to baseline, not really looking in any way like a worrying optimism bias at all, just a kind of correction of their optimism, pessimism balance. So quite a nice way perhaps to look at this reconnection phenomenon in a behavioral way. Another way we did that was to image people's brains using functional magnetic resonance imaging, looking at the brain's responsiveness to different stimuli. There's a very reliable rule that's been found in biological psychiatry that depressed patients have quite a responsive, slightly over-responsive to negative emotional stimuli in a particular emotion center, the amygdala. But what's even more reliable is that SSRIs will reduce that responsiveness, particularly to negative stimuli. And that seems to relate to treatment effectiveness to some extent. Now, what we found with psychedelics was something quite curious. We actually saw something in the other direction. So a really challenging finding that at first we thought might be problematic. So instead of the amygdala becoming less responsive to emotional stimuli, it was becoming more responsive, not just to negative stimuli, but to emotional stimuli in general. Now, the reason why, when we looked at the data more closely, it wasn't worrying is that it related to treatment response. So those who did better had this re-engagement, if you want, of the amygdala to a greater extent. And even when we looked at that contrast that's been the contrast of focus in the previous research with SSRIs between negative emotional stimuli, here it's just faces showing emotions of fear or sadness or happiness or neutral, whatever that is. Then even in that contrast of negative versus neutral, that SSRIs attenuate, we saw an augmentation, and the bigger the augmentation, the bigger the boost, if you want, in amygdala responsiveness, within that contrast, again, the better people were doing. So a very challenging finding there, and it may be suggesting that this is a treatment which is quite different. It's working on the serotonin system as SSRIs do, but there's something that's quite different about this treatment to chronic drug treatments like SSRIs. And if it's related to emotion, it may be that SSRIs moderate emotional responsiveness, and perhaps psychedelics are about an emotional re-engagement. And that might relate to these reports of a reconnection after treatment with psilocybin. Very complex model. I was in two minds about putting this in, but it's just this principle about relaxing and then revising beliefs and how that might underlie the therapeutic action of psychedelics. It's a bit of a fudge, the acronym REBUS, relax beliefs under psychedelics. Kind of sounds right. But that's under review at the moment. We'll see if it stands the test of time. It sort of works for me. So, and we start with the initiating event. We do know these compounds' pharmacology. They're not working via magic. They're stimulating a certain aspect of the serotonin system that induces a state of disorganization in the spontaneous brain activity. I'll talk about that in a moment. And those conditions may create the kind of conditions that would be needed for relearning, perhaps unlearning of pathological patterns of thought and behavior, and perhaps the opportunity with the right kind of care and integration work to recalibrate our internal models. It's not a given, of course, and we are seeing, as I'll show you in a moment, a lot of evidence for the importance of the contextual components to the treatment's effectiveness. So I was talking about that disorganization of ongoing brain activity. I could get lost in this slide, but it is quite important. I call it the entropic brain. It's basically speaking to the principle that when we fall into a state of unconsciousness, whether with an anesthetic or whether we fall asleep, or if we have a brain injury and have a disorder of consciousness and consciousness reduces or essentially disappears, then brain activity becomes more predictable, and that would be less entropic. It's simply more predictable relative to healthy waking consciousness. Here we could see in sleep, for example, during wake, this is entropy up here, or complexity, or unpredictability, if you want, of brain activity. Very complex, very entropic during wake. You fall into deep sleep, it drops, and it comes back up when we have our complex quality of consciousness during dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Here's a schematic that I show that these drugs and deep sleep take you down here, and perhaps psychedelics take you up here. Perhaps there's also a threshold in the same way that there's a threshold with anesthetics. You can, or sedatives. You can sedate people, but they don't lose full consciousness, but they can. And with psychedelics, perhaps you can take them into a weird and wonderful state of consciousness, but they can reflect, they're still conscious. Perhaps theoretically you can go beyond that. There are particularly potent psychedelics that don't seem to have the same safety profile as psilocybin, for example. A good example of that would be 5-methoxy-DMT, which people describe these whiteouts, that it's almost as if they merge with everything, cease to exist entirely. It can be, for some people it can be profoundly blissful, but for others it can be terrifying. And what seems to be the case is that people often actually struggle with the reintegration afterwards. How can you make sense of one's experience of reality to have such a profound experience as that, and then come back to this, this way of behaving? And so it's an interesting one. So anyway, that's the entropic brain principle. And here, this leads on to some of our brain imaging work that we did in the depression trial, and it's related to the reset analogy. And this isn't something we just came up with or based on the imaging results. Really, it started with what people were saying. So they would say after the treatment that they felt reset, they felt rebooted in some way. And again, this recalibration, someone else said defrag. It was like when you defrag the hard drive on your computer, so that's the kind of resorting of the hard drive, getting rid of redundant stuff and sort of, spring cleaning the hard drive in a way, simplifying things. And so they're using that analogy. what we were seeing in the brain in the depression work, I'll show you in a moment, sort of fitted with that. Time will tell whether it's a false interpretation, but I think it may well be right. Here is just one particular image from one of our studies giving LSD, looking at a particular brain network. It's called the default mode network. It's associated with high-level abstract thinking, thinking about oneself, reflection in general, imagination, internal thinking, introspection, autobiographical memory, stuff associated, with self-consciousness, if you want, and internal, very much high-level internal models. We saw that this network, and we've seen it with psilocybin, others have seen it with ayahuasca, essentially loses its integrity under the drug. It breaks down, it disintegrates, and that's something that we've seen quite reliably, as others have. We also see that rather than, if we don't just look at one system in isolation, as we did in the previous slide with the default mode network, but we look at the whole of the brain, or we look at how a particular system like the visual system speaks to the rest of the brain, then we see something quite curious. We actually see that system blending in with the rest of the brain, sort of melding into the rest of the brain. Here at baseline, we're asking the question, how does activity here in the primary visual cortex speak to the rest of the brain? And we find that it mostly speaks to other aspects of the brain that are concerned with vision. So a kind of cliquish sort of communication style during baseline. The system is specialized for a particular function, vision, and most of the communication is confined to the visual system. Here under LSD, asking exactly the same question, where does the primary visual cortex, we call it V1, very rudimentary aspect of the visual system, processing orientations, whether things are vertical or horizontal, quite simple things. But there we see that so much more of the brain is now communicating with that primary visual cortex. And that seems to relate to some of the subjective effects of the drug, the complex imagery that people can see with their eyes closed, and this principle of an increase in global connectivity. We see a decrease in within network integrity or connectivity. So systems themselves break down, but in breaking down, they meld with more of the rest of the brain. So there's an increase in global integration, but a decrease in local or within system integration. And again, this seems to correlate with some of the subjective effects of the drug. Now, I'm presenting all of this really as a prelude to what we saw in depression, which was quite different. So when we scanned people's brains, we did it at baseline when they were thoroughly depressed, and then we did it one day after their second treatment session. They'd come down from the drug entirely. They may well have been feeling pretty good, feeling lighter, more sort of relaxed and more headspace, but they weren't feeling any drug effects. They weren't hallucinating and having strange perceptual experiences. And when we did the subtraction, so before versus after, we saw that this particular system, again, it's the default mode network, the one that disintegrates during the drug experience. We actually saw that it reintegrated after the drug experience, and the magnitude of this effect, this reintegration, correlated with treatment response. So those, or related to treatment response, those who were responders at 5 weeks, which was a key endpoint when what we call the effect size was maximal. Those who had that reintegration of the default mode network were those who were more likely to be responding than the non-responders didn't have that reintegration to the same extent. So it seems to relate to treatment response. It seems to relate to the mechanisms. What does it mean? I think it's fair to say we don't know yet. And so I would only just put out there as a possibility the interpretation that it may relate to this reset mechanism. We see a disintegration within the default mode network acutely when people are in the throes of the psychedelic experience, and then post-acutely they come down, they describe feeling rebooted, reset, and lo and behold, that network reintegrates, maybe resets. So something to scrutinize further as we go forward. Now, this talk would really in no way do justice to the richness of the psychology of the psychedelic experience and really their principal effects if I didn't say something about insight. Remember, I started the talk by telling you about the etymology of psychedelic, that it means mind revealing. And I haven't really said that much about that. You know, what's revealed? And it turns out that you know, quite a lot can be revealed in a way that's principally what's happening. We found, first of all, that higher ratings of insight in relation to the acute experience was a good predictor, a significant predictor of the clinical outcomes. So more insight, bigger drops in depression. We also, in doing the interviews at 6 months, picked up a lot of cases of people talking about insight. Here a patient saying, I had fresh insight into things. It was as if the scales dropped from my eyes. And then different kind of qualities of insight are alluded to here. You have something which resonates quite nicely with a phenomenon that was born out of the Apollo missions, and astronauts going up into space, seeing, you know, the Earth rising, that classic image, being able to see the whole of the Earth more or less, and the profound effect that had on their psychology. This overview, you know, stepping out, seeing the big picture, thinking, how do we war with each other and even squabble with each other? How ridiculous and silly we are to be, you know, wrapped up in these kind of ego battles. And it's the same kind of thing that you'll see with psychedelics, you know, like Google Earth. I zoomed out. That was with reference to the psychedelic experience. That was actually from a patient who suffered quite severe trauma in childhood and was talking about sort of seeing things in context. Another one here, which relates to what you might call, what people call in computational neuroscience, fact-free learning. It's this principle of not necessarily picking up new information, just having the same information but seeing it differently. A shift in perspective, fact-free learning. And here an individual saying, I was being reminded of things I already knew. It wasn't really new information. It was just a shift in perspective, perhaps a broadening, being able to see things that before they couldn't really see. Another one saying at the bottom, I was convinced in that moment I'd figured it all out. That can be dangerous. It was, until you see what it was that they figured out. It was right there in front of me, love, the only thing that mattered. You know, you could characterize this, Michael Pollan in his best-selling book, How to Change Your Mind. It was a New York Times bestseller. What did he say about psychedelics? That, gosh, I'm not going to remember on the spot, but it was a kind of, you know, are they things that reveal to us the obvious? But, you know, how obvious really is it that we should see things in perspective and value love and such like? But if you wanted to be, you know, pour some cynicism on this, you might say that these are obvious things, you know, but we're so vulnerable to and susceptible to forgetting them, of course. Anyway, that's the chart just to show that bigger the insight, the bigger the drops in depression. I just want to go now into predictors of response, and this should really speak, I think, in a more intuitive way than maybe the brain imaging to what this treatment is doing. And again, you know, something unusual and challenging. I think if you can communicate at least how you think it's working and how the data is telling you it's working, then it starts to become less incredible. You know, eventually I think it will start to be obvious for people. And they'll be, oh, psychedelics, of course, yeah, it makes perfect sense. But this is looking at the nature of the acute experience, and these are different dimensions. These are the mystical experience questionnaire. I know, not even I can read this, but it's just to tell you the principles. Mystical experience scale, lots of items. Challenging experience scale, lots of items, and then one that we made up ourselves called the emotional breakthrough inventory. Why did we do that? Well, it was because we felt that this scale was problematic. Mysticism is something which is arguably antithetical to the naturalism of science. Science comes at the world and says, I'm going to try and understand all of this, as much as I can through testing. And supernaturalism says that there are things that we can't explain and can sometimes sort of bask in that mystery, the uncertainty. And to some extent, that's mysticism. It's sort of a ready acceptance of magic and supernatural. And you can't take that position as a scientist. Our agenda, openly, transparently, is to try and demystify. And it's a commitment, I said at the start, it's a commitment to nature to think that we should at least give that the best go possible. So with that in mind, there's a lot that's in this scale which is good, but I don't think there's anything in it which supports in any way, the existence of something magical and beyond the natural world. This does perform well. If people score high on the mystical experience questionnaire, they do have better clinical outcomes. But these are things, again, that I think are entirely understandable by describing and measuring the natural world. Things like a sense of oneness, a unitive experience. Remember I showed you those brains becoming more globally connected. That relates to certain aspects of the subjective experience that relate to the so-called spiritual or mystical experience, such as ego dissolution and a sense of oneness. You have a brain more globally integrated, people feel more connected to everything. Let's see. The challenging experience speaks to what sometimes people call bad trips. So it's more dysphoric experiences, fear, panic sometimes, sometimes paranoia, so sort of darker aspects. And then the EBI we came up with because we thought and we saw in some of the data that if you had a challenging experience, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But the key question was, can people go through the challenge, a kind of hero's journey, if you want, and have a breakthrough, have some kind of emotional release, emotional catharsis, perhaps some insight, and that could be therapeutically useful. So basically, we chucked all of these items from these scales into a model that was predicting changes in well-being. We saw that they were actually all useful, but the EBI performed at least as well as the others. It correlated with increases in well-being, higher scores on this emotional breakthrough inventory. Some of the factors: I faced emotionally difficult feelings that I usually push aside. I experienced a resolution of personal conflict/trauma. Felt able to explore challenging emotions and memories. I was able to get a sense of closure on an emotional problem. I achieved an emotional release followed by a sense of relief. So that performed very well. It was significantly predictive of the increases in well-being post-treatment. The MEQ scores and CEQs did similarly. And so the implication here is that each of these scales are predictive of the subjective response. We also found that the emotional breakthrough was influenced by context. If people had a therapeutic intention, higher scores, and a therapeutic setting, and aspects of the setting predict higher scores. Now, I'm conscious of time. It's so difficult to cover everything. Let me try and summarize this. So one way we collect data is our controlled studies. That's expensive. You only get a certain number of participants, and it's a lot of trouble in the process. I mean, the scientific rigor is good often, but is there another way? And people, of course, self-experiment with psychedelics. So can we tap into that? And that's something we've been doing recently using questionnaires that are hosted on psychedelicsurvey.com. This particular one looks at ceremonial use of psychedelics. What we do, which is novel in these surveys, is collect data prospectively. So people hear about this and sign up if they intend to take a psychedelic. And in the context of a psychedelic ceremony, which may well be entirely legal, it could be happening in South America, where it's legal, Brazil, Jamaica, the Netherlands, then it's entirely above board. And if people intend to do this anyway, this is how we defend it with the ethics committee, and they understand it. And I think that's right. Why not make it data? Why not make this self-experimentation data? I think you can argue that on a safety level as much as anything else. So that's what we do. We collect this data, and I just wanted to show it, and we do it prospectively. I wanted to show it because, we see these increases in well-being. This is from the ceremonies. This is from just any kind of use of psychedelics. So there seems to be a bit of an edge when people use these. This is any kind of psychedelic in a ceremonial context, usually ayahuasca or mushrooms. But the key thing is the predictors, and in this particular study, we found something quite interesting. So you can see the significance on the right, and I'm highlighting the ones that were significant. Emotional breakthrough was a better predictor than any of the others, better than mystical experience. That didn't come out as significant. And again, this is emotional breakthrough during the experience predicting increases in well-being afterwards, or just changes in well-being, which did increase on average. Also, this thing called communitas, which is a kind of losing oneself in the group. Sometimes that's a negative thing. Sometimes, in this case, for example, it might be a positive thing. So when people had that, losing their self, feeling part of a group, they had that was predictive of changes in well-being, increases in well-being. So let me draw it to a conclusion, if I can. This is a model which shows things in red, very broadly and simply. Red is bad. These are things that you don't want. They'll have a negative influence on things that you might want, like breakthrough and communitas. You might want them because they're associated with improvements in well-being. So any solid line is a significant relationship, and the thickness is related to the degree of the extent of the relationship. You see people who want to escape their emotions do particularly badly. They don't have therapeutic experiences. Those who feel ready and prepared for the experience are more likely to have a breakthrough. And we also see anxiety predicting having a challenging experience. That makes sense. Trait absorption, which is the tendency to be immersed in stimuli, that promotes the visual effects of the drug. So these are predictors here we're putting to one side. Then we look at the aspect of the context. Supportive individuals predict having a breakthrough. If there are distractions or disruptions, that gets in the way of having this communitas, losing oneself in the group. And let's try and get to a way where we can put them all together in terms of some predictors. Being ready, having supportive individuals is associated with emotional breakthrough and this communitas. If you want to escape emotions and have that intention, or there are disruptions in the environment, then you're less likely to have these things. So it's suggesting, things that might be useful in psychedelic therapy. There are questions at the moment around cost effectiveness, and these are real world questions that we have to take seriously. SSRIs as a treatment model are very cost effective. They're cheap and they're easy to dish out, and that's why they dominate mental health care, really. Psychotherapy, comparatively, is expensive. It'd be great if everyone could have it, but the world doesn't work like that. So maybe if you could have some kind of combination of drug and therapy, and perhaps even a situation where you have people being treated in groups in the right kind of way, not in any way cutting any corners with regard to safety, then maybe there's something about that which could be useful in terms of cost effectiveness and just effectiveness in general. Lots to think about as we go forwards. So what is this treatment model? How can you break it down? Well, there isn't really time to talk about energy landscapes, but you can think of the mind as falling into patterns, falling into ruts, perhaps happens in depression, that people can get stuck in a rut, stuck in their depression, very hard to get out of it, very easy to be pulled back into it. How with psychedelics, maybe there is a flattening of the mind and the brain's energy landscape. A lot of evidence, suggestive evidence at this stage to support it, apart from this new finding of ours where we're actually seeing it literally for the first time. So that's just recently been published. There, I think I will end it with a little bit of poetry. Why not? What kind of system would we want? Well, one that's in harmony with data coming from within, coming from without, a balanced system, not a stormy one, not a frozen one, and sometimes perhaps only by venturing far out can we truly come home. Thank you.
About 5 minutes for questions, so if you want to pick out 1 or 2 people from the crowd.
Sure, yes, I promised I would ask you.
About microdosing, how much would you recommend? How would you suggest to take it?
Gosh. Yeah, no, I love the relaxed way you asked that, as if we're there already, you know. Well, the truth is we don't know, and there's a lot of guesswork about microdosing that's coming from self-experimentation, and there's a lot of people doing it. You know, it's more a question of who isn't doing it. I've kind of discovered, no, really, in Silicon Valley, you know, big players there have had experiences, but we don't really understand it conceptually. I can see how it might work, that it's sort of and we've got some data. We're doing 2 questionnaires to look at this at the moment, both prospective and one that actually asks people to self-blind. So they buy or they get hold of their LSD tabs and they chop them up. You know, if they follow the instructions, they're basically running a true self-experiment. And this got through the ethics committee. Again, it's if the intention is there, you know, why not make it data? We're collecting data on that, but we've got other data coming in, which is suggesting that this is, the key question is this more than a massive expectancy effect? Because we know from all sorts of research that the placebo effect, which is a positive expectancy effect, is massive. It's hard for SSRIs to show an edge in a lot of studies above that. They do, but it's hard, and it's clearer in severe depression. And so it's likely, you know, if you're thinking that microdosing is something good for you and it's going to help you, that there's a massive expectancy effect. We saw some things in the data which suggested there's something more than an expectancy effect. So first of all, we measured expectancy at baseline, and then we looked at change in mental health outcomes like well-being, and it wasn't a predictor. And that was kind of a surprise, because personally, I kind of sort of sat on the fence a little bit about this one and just didn't know, because it's easy to underestimate the size of the positive expectancy effect. But it wasn't a predictor. And then when we looked at the acute experience, certain aspects were predictors. So items that are speaking to mindfulness, being present-centered, that if that was stronger, they were having improvements in well-being. So my hunch is, based on a bit of data, not much, and a book by Eilert Waldman called A Really Good Day. I mean, honestly, this is all there is out there in terms of evidence, and yet it's become this huge meme with people doing it, all around the world. But my hunch is that it's an attenuated version of what you get with a full dose. It's maybe heightening a present-centeredness and maybe insight as well. That's something that I saw in Eilert Waldman's book. But perhaps hopefully that helps. So I can't answer a question like that, of course.
To be the most mindful when you take LSD, would you recommend, rather than having outside stimulus, to be completely in the dark and just close your eyes and also focus inwards?
Well, that's what people do in a full dose experience, but the idea with microdosing is that you get on your bike and cycle to Silicon Valley and Google headquarters or something. So the idea is that you can function and go to work. That's why people take such low doses. But, so many questions left to address. I'm sorry, but I can't say what dose to take of a microdose or even to do it.
Just time for one more question.
Sure. Hi, yes.
Thank you. You measured coherence measure, Was that EEG frequency, brainwave frequency, you were referring to?
Did I look at coherence?
Well, you mentioned global connectedness.
Yes.
I assume, well, I'm not sure.
Yes, it's
Was it EEG?
no, sorry, it's fMRI, so it's a slower signal.
I suggest that would be a good measure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're looking at it now. It's a bit of complication about coherence measures because of the amplitude in general shallowing, and so you can see changes in coherence that are kind of secondary to a change in the amplitude. But we will look there. Yeah, and we do EEG and MEG with psychedelics. Is there time for one more? One arm shot up at the back. I just feel like it's good. Yeah, sorry.
Brilliant lecture, thank you. You mentioned at the very beginning that there are some certain substances block HT receptors. Could you talk a little bit about that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so serotonin 2A receptor antagonists have been trialled for sleep, trying to promote, they seem to promote deep sleep. They've been looked at in the context of what is it? Maybe psychosis related to Alzheimer's, I think, and hallucinations, particularly in Alzheimer's. And I think they managed to get licensing there. They've been looked at in the context of schizophrenia, but never showed a good enough signal to achieve licensing. But they seem to be mildly and subtly sedating. And so it's speaking to a different kind of treatment model, and it's the model that's dominated psychiatry arguably since the pharmacological revolution in terms of drugs that mitigate symptom severity. They'll help take the edge off psychotic symptoms, say, or severe self-loathing and stress in depression, but whether or not they have the same, they're in the same way. I think of psychedelics as kind of insight treatments, really. I put up this phrase earlier on as, what is it here? Epistemic transformation. I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Molly Crockett. She probably got it from elsewhere, always borrowing each other's stuff. But no, the idea of a shift in one's knowledge. After the experience, you know something that before you didn't. And it's hard to unknow it. And maybe you can cultivate that knowledge that you've acquired in those experiences. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Robin. Let's everybody give Robin a round of applause.